So if you are here to sleep because this room is amazing for that, you're probably going to have your sleep interrupted for at least the next hour and a half. But if you're here to talk about freedom of expression, stick around and get into it with us, please. So welcome, thanks for coming out. I am Christopher McKnight Nichols. I'm a historian here at OSU, and I'm the director of our Citizenship and Crisis Initiative, which is a program of engaged democracy, which seeks to bring the best insights of history and the humanities to bear on pressing contemporary issues. I'm honored to have helped organize this event. I have a few thank yous to get out of the way, a few prefatory remarks, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and eventually we'll get into a discussion. What a time for this panel, right? What a time to be thinking about freedom of expression, its limits, its strengths, a constitutional democracy. It's a real pleasure to be here with you to discuss these issues, and I want to thank President Ed Ray, who sent out a message about this, and for his support of developing institutional values related to freedom of expression. Also want to thank Vice Provost Susie Brubaker-Cole, who's here on the panel, and the Office of Student Affairs, who've taken very seriously our imperative as a land-grant institution to embody the values of freedom of expression. Also have to thank the OSU Center for the Humanities, who supported this, the College of Liberal Arts, the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, the cultural centers, diversity engagement, and other parts of OSU are all deeply involved and invested in questions of freedom of expression. Special thanks to Natalia Bueno, to Jen Humphreys, and to Ryan Khalif, who helped organize a whole lot of the elements of this program today. So first and foremost, we've got some food and drink. Please take some. It will help fuel you through our discussion of freedom of expression. There's cookies, there's coffee, there's caffeine, all that good stuff. Second, as a reminder in this cacophonous sort of a room, please turn off your phones, silence things, that sort of stuff. We don't want to have that level of expression is not necessary or endorsed. All right, third, on format. We've got a bunch of really superb experts here to share a variety of perspectives. Each of them will speak. They're designed to say a few words, just 10 minutes of remarks, something thought-provoking on this crucial issue of freedom of expression. We'll then open things up for a collective discussion. So the idea here is really to have a kind of town hall format. We want to hear your opinions, your views as we go through this. Our goal is primarily analysis and discussion, trying to make sense of freedom of expression and freedom of expression at Oregon State University, and rather than indulging in remarks that are, say, partisan or overtly parochial and narrow. We want to have a big, broad kind of a discussion here today. All right, so today's event, it builds on a panel that we held on Constitution Day, which was September 16th of this year, and for which we had tremendous interest, actually a standing room only crowd, and unfortunately we had insufficient time to really have a deep discussion, or as deep of a discussion as we wanted. But there's more to it than that. Once a year at OSU, our official purpose, because we receive dollars from the federal government, is to, quote, recognize and celebrate the origin and purposes of the Constitution. But it's not just about that. We don't do this in a kind of triumphalist way, but instead we want to come together to enact the sort of very best of what the Constitution aspires towards and not be overly invested in any particular project. So we come together to think, to discuss, to achieve greater understanding as a community. Having selected a vital theme or issue at stake in contemporary politics and society or law related to the Constitution, we then focus on that as a means of thinking more deeply about the Constitution itself. Here at OSU and in Corvallis, we have a whole lot of great scholars and people to come together to help us deliberate these kinds of issues. So our theme in September is more or less the same as our topic today. The First Amendment, and in particular the hot-button set of issues related to freedom of expression on campus. In the classroom and beyond the classroom in terms of academic freedom, expression, protest, and all of those corollaries. So today we'll be discussing these important issues with a focus on freedom of expression. Now the First Amendment to the Constitution, of course, was adopted and signed in 1787. It was ratified in 1788. I'm a historian, so I have to give you dates. And it states, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All right, so what does that mean? What does that do? Well, the First Amendment guarantees freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and the right to petition. It prohibits Congress from both promoting one religion over another and also restricting an individual's religious practices. It guarantees freedom of expression by forbidding Congress from restricting the press or the rights of individuals to speak freely, and it also guarantees the right of citizens to assemble peaceably and to petition their government. Lest we think this is just a US thing or that it's just located in the 18th century, we should be reminded that this is actually a global sort of a value. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as adopted in 1948 and enshrined through the United Nations, protects, quote, freedom of expression as the right of every individual to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. All right, so if it's global and it's American, what is free speech? Well, our panelists will help us analyze this. What are the limits of speaking freely in terms of content or in terms of place? And should there be any limits at all? What counts as speech, especially in the 21st century? This is a really pressing sort of a question for us. Given events on campus and in communities across the country, not just in the wake of the election, which seems so pressing to us today, but throughout over the past year, actually several years, there have been a lot of issues at the intersection of the limits and openness of free speech on college campuses. I would argue that these aren't new questions in American democracy or society. Hotly contested interpretations of this and what all these rights entail have embroiled American legal, political, and social life since the 1780s, since the adoption of the Constitution, the First Amendment. The Supreme Court, citizens, students, and scholars, as well as others, have struggled mightily over time to determine what exactly constitutes protected speech. Most speech, both direct, such as words, and indirect or symbolic, such as actions, have tended to be entitled to First Amendment protections. But there are boundaries, and frequently, I would argue, history reveals that in times of crisis and catastrophe, such as wars or economic downturns, those lines have been drawn more sharply and often restrictively. So free speech is very often limited in times of crisis. Our emphasis today will be on those issues of speech, and our focus will be on at least one way of looking at this that's new here at Oregon State, where we've developed the institutional statement on freedom of expression values, which you see on chairs around here, and they're circulating. We have copies here to hand out, and we encourage you to take them home, in fact, and think more deeply about these questions of freedom of expression. We also will seek to contextualize these and related topics in political thought and practice and in philosophy, as well as activism. And here we have Professors Andrew Valls and Joseph Orosco to help us with this. Vice Provost Susie Brubaker-Cole will help us think through how OSU is dealing with and developing this question related to the expression of values. And we'll aim to explore with Faye Chadwell, who's the director of the University Press and in charge of our library, what freedom of expression means in the library system here on campus, and more broadly in terms of publishing. All right, suffice it to say we've got a lot to do, and now I have to stop, so we can move on. I can introduce our panelists, and we can actually really dig into this great issue. But one last time, I want to emphasize something really important about this moment in thinking about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. As the First Amendment's protections of freedom of expression and the Constitution more broadly, they're nothing if not a mechanism by which to protect our free speech. And we need to keep that in mind and exercise that right as much as possible, however we see fit to do so. All right, so first up, we've got Professor Andrew Valls. He's an Oregon State University Associate Professor in Political Science in the School of Public Policy, currently serves as Political Science Program Coordinator, and is a specialist in political theory. He's written extensively on race and racism in contemporary society, as well as modern philosophy and on ethics and international affairs. His books and edited works include Race and Racism and Modern Philosophy. He has a new edited book out on David Hume on morals, politics, and society, and I'm really excited about his new forthcoming book on racial justice. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Andrew Valls.
Right. I'm going to lower this a little bit. Thank you, Chris. I want to thank Chris Nichols for organizing this and inviting me and to the others who are involved in organizing this and making this event possible. It's an honor to be here among my esteemed colleagues. I just want to take a few minutes to sort of lay out what I see as the kind of conceptual sort of landscape involving political theory and constitutional law with respect to freedom of speech, just very, very briefly, and then hoping to, looking forward to our discussion after all of the formal presentations. Freedom of speech is both a political and a constitutional value, right? It's embodied both in the Constitution, as Chris has emphasized, but it's also a more general value in political theory, both democratic and liberal political theory. And indeed, there are I would identify two sets of reasons why we should value freedom of speech, categorized generally as democratic reasons and liberal reasons. The democratic reasons for endorsing freedom of speech are simply that freedom of speech seems to be a prerequisite for collective self-government. That is, citizens must be able to express their own views and preferences if they are to have any kind of input into governmental decisions. And of course, free press is also essential to checking and limiting government power. So to have a functioning democracy, you need freedom of speech. But when I talk about liberal reasons to endorse freedom of speech, that's something else again. Here, when I speak of liberal, I'm referring to sort of classical liberalism, the tradition of John Locke and John Stuart Mill, that emphasizes that governmental power should be limited and that individuals should possess a certain sphere of activity within which no one, neither the state nor other individuals, are entitled to interfere. So the sort of liberal, in the classical sense of liberalism, argument for freedom of speech is simply that speech falls within that sort of zone of privacy within which no one else is entitled to interfere. But of course, things are not so simple. We may have very good reasons to endorse freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that there are not further issues and questions that it raises. One issue is that freedom of speech is one value among many. It's not our only value. It's not a value that necessarily is going to always trump other values. So some of those other values might be, for example, public order. So we can't just go around yelling fire in a crowded theater. We value a fair trial, and sometimes the freedom of the press can interfere with having a fair trial. Some people think that equalizing citizen power is an important value, and that may have to limit freedom of speech with regard to campaign finance. And of course, sometimes, potentially, people can be harmed by free speech, although that's a contentious assertion. But if there are such cases, then of course we want to prevent harm and therefore arguably limit speech in some way. But that raises the further question of what is harm? What's a relevant kind of harm that would justify limiting free speech? One kind that's recognized in the law is defamation. Right? So you can sue someone for defamation after the fact if they believe that their reputation has been wrongly harmed by something you have either written or said. But what about merely being offended by something someone has said or by some other expression of freedom of speech? Classic hard cases under this heading include pornography and hate speech. Now, John Stuart Mill, the 19th century political theorist and philosopher, who wrote one of the most important defenses of free speech on liberty, argued that mere expression of an idea can never cause the kind of harm or a sufficient amount of harm to warrant its restrictions. Mill thought we are always better off, particularly in the long run, by allowing more speech rather than less, and therefore he thought that freedom of speech should never or almost never be abridged. But Mill had a great deal of faith in the marketplace of ideas to eventually weed out truth from falsehood. And he may have been wrong in that faith, and he may also have been wrong to argue that mere words can never do any kind of harm in the relevant sense. Okay, one further complication that I'll mention quickly is that the line between actions and words is not always clear. Freedom of speech, of course, is about speech, but sometimes a mere act that is not accompanied by any utterance is considered speech, such as, say, burning a flag. Whereas other kinds of speech are sometimes treated by the law as action. For example, in the fighting words doctrine, right, where trying to start a fight or saying something that's likely to result in violence, those words are considered actions in the relevant sense and therefore not protected necessarily. One further question that I think we'll be getting into later is what about state speech? What may the state say through its various organs? First and foremost, may the state promote certain kinds of values? Can it take sides? It can't do that with respect to religion, but what about other kinds of disputes and moral views? May the state promote, for example, liberal democratic values, or must it remain neutral among all points of view? Okay, so that's the very broad sweep of the intellectual landscape that we're dealing with here. In the U.S. context, of course, as has already been mentioned, free speech is protected by the First Amendment, and I thank Chris for reading it so that I don't have to. It's interesting to note that the First Amendment, the first word there is Congress. So one thing to note is that originally the First Amendment, like the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were intended to apply only to Congress or by extension to the federal government, but not to state governments. It's only in the 20th century that the Supreme Court has applied many of the rights in the Bill of Rights to states, meaning that in this case, states may not infringe on the freedom of speech any more than the federal government may. And it's only late in the 20th century that the Supreme Court elaborated its current doctrine that provides a great deal of protection to freedom of speech. Earlier in our history, the Supreme Court was much more permissive about government's restrictions on freedom of speech, but we now have, in light of decisions coming out of the 60s and 70s primarily, a very robust set of constitutional doctrines that provide a very sort of high hurdle that must be crossed before the government may restrict speech. So any restriction now bears a very heavy burden of proof. Indeed, compared to many other liberal democracies, the United States has among the more absolutist legal doctrines of freedom of speech, so that, for example, restrictions that would be permissible in other countries, like in Germany, for example, would not be permitted in the United States. In Germany, it's illegal to display a swastika or to deny the Holocaust, but those kinds of expressions would clearly be permissible under current United States Supreme Court doctrine. So what about all of this as it relates to universities? Well, of course, freedom of speech has special importance in higher education. Fundamental to higher education is the exploration of ideas, the uninhibited expression of them. Universities are supposed to push the boundaries of knowledge and thought. Ideas are to be tested against one another and against the evidence without any kind of prejudgment. So universities are supposed to be very sort of special places where freedom of speech is particularly prized, and freedom of speech is to be protected on the part of both faculty and students. But again, things are more complicated than they appear at first. Academic freedom as a kind of close cousin to freedom of speech as it applies to university campuses turns out to be quite complex and have a number of different meanings. One meaning of academic freedom is that the university as a whole should be protected from outside interference in terms of the curriculum that it offers. The curriculum is to be in the hands of the faculty as a whole, according to traditional doctrines related to academic freedom. Similarly, academic departments are to have control over the curriculum that's offered within that department, the idea being that those are the experts in that particular field of inquiry, and so they should be the ones to decide what the relevant curriculum is for their particular program. But of course, academic freedom also applies to individuals, right? So individual faculty members are supposed to have wide latitude in terms of how they teach and what they teach. And yet, there are inevitably going to be tensions among these three levels of academic freedom, right? Because to the extent that as a collectivity, the faculty as a whole or the faculty within a department can have academic freedom by controlling the curriculum within that. That might infringe on what an individual faculty member sees as his or her freedom of speech, right, and vice versa. So it turns out to be complicated and to have some internal tensions. We see other tensions between freedom of speech or academic freedom on the one hand and other kinds of values in higher education on the other in some recent developments. And I just want to emphasize two, one having to do more with the faculty side and one having to do more with the student side. Colleges and universities are being called to account these days much more than they used to be, to account to the public and to the state that sometimes funds them to a certain extent, in terms of what they are doing and how they are doing it. So there are lots of demands now for assessment and accountability so that universities can demonstrate that they are actually achieving what they claim to be achieving. Now, some see these demands for accountability as a threat to the autonomy of the institution and therefore a threat to academic freedom. And when universities try to meet these demands, the institution itself can in turn arguably threaten the academic freedom of individual units and perhaps individual faculty members. So there's a tension here. That's what I want to emphasize. Not to take a side necessarily, but it seems like the demand for some accountability is a reasonable one, and yet the concern about freedom of speech is also a reasonable one, and the two may be in tension. On the student side, in recent years, we've seen lots of demands for such things as trigger warnings, speech codes, safe spaces, demands for greater sensitivity in terms of how people express themselves, both faculty and students, objections to what are sometimes called microaggressions, right? These too may be quite reasonable objections or may be raising legitimate issues that are worthy of consideration. And yet, depending on how they are interpreted and implemented, if they are, they too can exist in substantial tension with the ideals of freedom of speech. So just to conclude, I want to emphasize that these tensions are tensions among genuine values, right, and among genuinely valuable things. It seems to me that we want both freedom and, say, mutual respect. Both academic freedom and and freedom of speech on the one hand, and accountability. It's not always clear how to reconcile these, and resolving that issue itself requires public discussion, argument, and freedom of speech. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. And next up, we have our great Vice Provost, Susie Brubaker-Cole. She's Vice Provost for Student Affairs, a scholar of French literature, a fellow elected officer of our great new Phi Beta Kappa chapter, which I always want to mention every time I speak in public. And in her position as Vice Provost, she's a key member of the executive leadership team of OSU, working with the president and collaborating with others to develop and implement policies concerning students and general university programs. She also is well-versed in some of the legal issues related to student speech patterns. So here's Susie Brubaker-Cole.
Thank you so much, and I'll begin with a, disclaimer, which is that although I have some experience thinking about some of the legal issues, I am not an attorney, nor am I trained in that way. So you may want to have information at the end of the session that I simply don't have the expertise to answer, but I'll do my best. So over the last 6 months, OSU has developed an institutional statement on freedom of expression, which, as was mentioned earlier, is, I hope, on every chair that you're sitting in, but if not, there's extra copies in the front row and some in between. My plan for my remarks is first to give a sense of the dynamics that have given rise to this statement in OSU and to similar statements at other universities across the country. Second, to talk a bit about the process and considerations that went into the development of our statement. And third, to share what I view as some potential important next steps for use and education around free speech to derive the intended value of the statement. So let me begin with two poignant examples of free speech situations on campuses over the last year that I believe do a good job of capturing the complexity of the issue and how contested it is and full of tension it is across the country. So I want to frame this by saying that I will not be endorsing any particular viewpoint on the instances I'm going to raise. My purpose is simply to make visible some of the issues that arise and to spot those issues. So, first example was a speaker sponsored by a student organization at a university in the United States in the Midwest. This was a public event in a university auditorium. The speaker that was invited was known in advance for being incendiary in his opinions, and indeed, at one point, I see heads nodding, I think you know what I'm talking about maybe. Indeed, at one point during his talk, he commented on the concept of microaggressions, stating something to the effect of, in fact, this is a quote, a near quote, they're so micro that they don't even really exist. There's nothing there. At which point, one student, followed by another student, followed by another student who had been sitting in the audience, came on stage, and soon there was a large group on stage. Well, the event could not proceed as planned, and it was simply canceled on the spot. There was a lot of discussion on campus afterwards. Here are some of the questions that were raised. Again, I'm not endorsing any of these questions or any particular answer. I simply want to spot the issues. Should the speaker have been invited in the first place? Given his reputation, people knew he was incendiary. Was it hate speech? And if so, how should that hate speech be treated? Should the event have been canceled when the stage was occupied? Should there be disciplinary consequences for the students who interrupted and claimed to be exercising their own free speech? If so, on what grounds would there be disciplinary actions? Okay, another example. At many campuses across the country, including our own, during, before, and after the elections, there have been a series of chalkings in favor of candidate, now President-elect Donald Trump, on sidewalks in public spaces. Some of these have included references to the wall that Trump has proposed building at the U.S. border. Some have mentioned negative viewpoints on Islam, and some have made homophobic or racist statements. People opposed to the chalkings have taken various actions to negate them: crossing out, erasing, defacing, dumping water on, or writing counter-speech next to them. Questions that have been raised on campuses in the wake of these chalkings. Again, I'm endorsing none of these questions, simply raising them. Do any of these messages constitute a threat to populations on campus? Some student groups certainly perceive them as such. What happens when the chalkings are erased or defaced? Are speech rights being violated? If so, whose speech rights are being violated exactly? Should colleges consider changing policy on the use of sidewalks with regard to free speech or protected speech zones? Why are campuses not pursuing investigations more aggressively to determine responsibility? To what extent does the university have responsibility to protect students or community members who feel threatened or targeted or marginalized by these chalkings? And why aren't we, universities, punishing people who make hate speech? And I will cite a study at Yale that was done in the last few years, where 72% of students surveyed favor disciplinary action against any student or faculty member on campus who uses language that is considered racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. Now, there are many other examples that I could talk about on our campus and others. For example, the preacher who comes and visits the library quad, I think every year, and I think Faye might mention that a little later on, but I think that this is adequate to sort of demonstrate the complexity of issues that this raises. What we observed in particular responses to what many of us consider offensive speech was a broadly divergent understanding of what constitutes free speech. There was lots of evidence on this campus that nobody was sharing the same definition of what was meant by free speech, freedom of expression. And there was also divergent opinion on what role the university has in protecting or shutting down speech. So this led a group of university leaders to propose creating an institutional statement on freedom of expression, which you have in front of you today. The charge came from the provost, who at the time was Sabah Randhawa. He wrote to request the participation of a group of faculty, students, and staff in working in a group to create an OSU institutional statement on freedom of expression. and I'm quoting from his charge to the group. Like many campuses nationally, OSU has recently experienced a number of incidents that raise questions about rights, responsibilities, and institutional positions regarding freedom of expression. The frequency with which these issues arise is likely to increase, and he was right on this point, given the social and political climates of the day. Several universities had recently created statements on freedom of expression, or sometimes called principles of intolerance, to clarify institutional position, rights and responsibilities, and community expectations. The provost asked that this working group draft a statement that articulates OSU's commitment to freedom of expression with the goal of fostering broad understanding of the values of freedom of expression in a university community. He also asked that the statement promote understanding of the university's approach to responding to various speech acts in order to protect freedom of expression, but also, and this is critical, to exercise counter speech as a means to reaffirm deeply held community values at OSU against acts of hatred and other intolerant conduct. So, the committee that was charged with this looked at a number of statements from universities across the country, some of which have existed for some 10, 15 years. Duke University, University of Chicago, California, Berkeley, Yale, Illinois, Indiana, and so on. We pulled out some common themes from these, but also added some elements that are unique to our campus values and goals for the statement. So the resulting statement accomplishes a few key things. First, it recognizes the inherently fraught and difficult nature of free speech, and that it will inevitably raise strong emotional responses. It asserts that disagreements and conflicting viewpoints are and should be an integral part of education, learning, intellectual discourse, and an educational community. It also acknowledges that offensive speech is generally still protected under free speech by the US and Oregon constitutions. It communicates expectations of respect in our community, even in the most vehement disagreements. It cites limitations that the university can place on speech, which is captured in our time, place, manner policy, where, when, and how. And unique to our statement at OSU, it asserts that the university may and will exercise counter-speech in accord with our values of equity and inclusion. And there have been many examples of counter-speech on campus to date, even before this statement was published. And to our knowledge, we are the only statement in the country that includes that statement that we will exercise and have the right to exercise counter-speech to reassert our values. Now, in addition, recently we've added a new section to this statement that relates to the right to assembly, otherwise known as protest and demonstration. The overarching purpose of this addition is to preserve and protect the rights to assembly and free speech. It sets several expectations for campus, both students, the administration, faculty. First, that the university is committed to enacting the lowest possible level of response within the limits of safety, of course, of all who are participating in the assembly. It also affirms that protest and activism have historically been important vehicles for change and for greater equity and inclusion, and it affirms that protest and public action are important today and will be important today as vehicles for critical social change. It emphasizes the need to ensure safety and commits to bringing in law enforcement action as a last resort when safety is compromised. And it also expresses that the university administration will actively seek to engage with protesters, not to hide away in recesses of the university, which does happen on some campuses, to communicate with people who are assembling and demonstrating, and to seek to understand perspectives on the issues. So this is now on the university website, which is a passive and I think inadequate means of dissemination, and I'm so happy that this event is happening today to help others many more think about it, and learn more about free speech. But I'd like to end with a very short list of a wish list of other things that I think we can do to help educate and raise discussion about the issue of freedoms of expression. First, I would love it if there would be more opportunities to discuss, to deepen understanding, and yes, to have the opportunity to dispute and argue different points of view about speech and assembly. Second, there was an excellent article published last year by two law faculty at UC Irvine who taught a freshman seminar on freedom of speech. And they noted in the article how today's students' political consciousness formed largely during a period when they saw the harms of bullying and hateful speech prior to coming to college, but less so the social harms of censorship or punishment meted out for dissenting voices. And these authors note that their students had been surprised to learn, for example, that people went to prison for criticizing the draft, for speaking out against the draft during World War I, or for espousing communist views in the 1920s, 30s, and the McCarthy era. Which brings me to my final thought. I think it is important to provide support for faculty in academic departments, as well as for professional faculty who work with students outside the formal classroom environment in understanding the values of free speech and the consequences of restricting and punishing speech. Faculty and staff would benefit greatly from more experiences understanding how to facilitate debate and disagreement when controversy arises, and to help students engage in these moments freely and actively. So while this institutional statement is a starting point, our collective goal should be to create a campus climate where students learn, not just students, faculty and staff as well, how to oppose and contest one another's ideas, and can practice and refine how to articulate and defend their values, and can learn that often the best response to hateful or offensive speech is more speech, counter speech, and not silence. Thank you.
All right, that was excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on, we have our fantastic university librarian and director of the OSU Press, Faye Chadwell. And when I asked her for her bio for this introduction, she responded, as Linus Pauling said, quote, "If you want to have good ideas, you must have many ideas. Most of them will be wrong. And what you have to learn is which ones to throw away." Faye Chadwell tells me that she became a librarian to help folks obtain access to those many ideas, to figure out the ones worth keeping or to create new ones, and she's been at OSU trying to do that since 2007.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel and want to share some insights about why is the library at all involved in the freedom of expression, and share a little bit of history about the development of that role. Libraries exist because there's an idea that access to more speech or more expression, and that's, I think, made manifest in the books and journals and archives and manuscripts that we curate, that they can create a path to a more democratic society. And for me personally, to a society that has a deeper understanding, if not respect, for diversity and inclusion. Even before the university's creation and adoption of the freedom of expression statement, OSU libraries had been following similar principles that are outlined in some of our profession's policies related to intellectual freedom, another word for academic freedom or freedom of expression. And one of the key documents is the American Libraries Association Library Bill of Rights. And I just wanted to share a couple of broad tenets that the Bill of Rights have and communicate to you some of the founding ideals for why libraries would be involved in freedom of expression. So one of the tenets is books and other library resources should be provided to meet the needs of people in the community for their enlightenment and for their entertainment. So materials shouldn't be excluded because of their origin, because of the origin, background, or views of the people who created those materials. Libraries should provide materials and information presenting all viewpoints, whether those viewpoints have to do with current issues or historical issues. So we would not exclude material from libraries as librarians because of our own personal viewpoints or biases, and we wouldn't exclude them because of the biases or viewpoints of the communities that we serve. And the other thing is someone's right to use a library shouldn't be denied because of that person's identity, background, age, or viewpoint. And that last statement, I think, really connects well to the university's freedom of expression statement and the university's goal to provide everyone a chance to succeed, learn, and discover information. So We in libraries, and this includes OSU libraries, we believe that the rights to privacy and confidentiality are also essential to exercising free speech. That means that when you choose to read something, it's not anybody else's business. And I think that echoes something that Andrew had said earlier. It's private. And because it's possible for libraries and other groups to capture personally identifiable information about what books you've checked out, what databases you've searched, what questions you've asked, we practice acts of confidentiality to keep information private. So how do privacy and confidentiality relate to the freedom of expression or freedom of speech? Well, if others know what you're reading or think they know what you're reading, they may try to use that against you and intimidate you into abstaining from further discovery or from inquiry, and thus freely expressing your own opinions. So basically, we would object to the assumption that just because you're looking for information on climate change or global warming, that you're going to become an eco-terrorist. I said earlier that the library is a manifestation as a cultural institution of the freedom of expression. And if you think about all those volumes and all those millions of words and images in those volumes, it's a powerful notion for a society or a university to create and maintain a space where people have access to information and they can read that information freely. And obviously for some people that's a dangerous notion too, and that drives attempts to censor content, and censorship, as we know, stifles access. It shuts down the freedom of expression. We take for granted that there's the ability to go into a public library or an academic library and find information that we need that's of interest to us, and that may include information that others do not want us to have for whatever reason. And here's where I want to really talk about where libraries haven't done such a good job. Because while we maybe have become that manifestation of freedom of expression in some people's minds, we don't have a clean history, we don't have an untarnished history. And I think some of the examples that I would have would echo some of the things that Chris said, that incidents of war and aggression really don't bring out the best in us in terms of freedom of expression. And that's certainly not true in library history. Here in Oregon, during World War II, Portland's public library exemplified a typical public response to what was really somewhat rampant xenophobia. The Oregonian accounts in June and July of 1919 report that a library board member urged the board to ban all foreign language papers as a step toward Americanization, and said that it would be wise policy to also ban materials that were not in the American language. And it wasn't until the 1930s that the American Library Association, and that's our major professional association, that it took some really decisive position on censorship. And that was supposedly in response, and this should probably not surprise anybody at the time, to a lot of objections to John Steinbeck's novel, Grapes of Wrath. And another example around, like I said, our somewhat tarnished history. Just yesterday, in his tearful acceptance of National Book Award, Congressional Representative John Lewis recalled this memory. He said, "I remember in 1956 when I was 16 years old, going down to the public library, trying to get library cards, and we were told that the libraries were white only and not for coloreds." So if you fast forward to 1970, and here's where those ebbs and flows of not being so good, being better about fighting censorship. But in 1970, the first United States librarian was actually jailed. Her name was Zoa Horn. She was a Bucknell University librarian. She was jailed for almost 3 weeks because she refused to share information in a court case against the Harrisburg Seven, and that was a group that protested against the Vietnam War. She refused because she said that testifying, even when she was granted immunity, would violate her professional principles regarding privacy and intellectual freedom. And one more example. Just after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was passed, librarians across the U.S. opposed any use of government power to suppress the free and open exchange of knowledge and information or to intimidate those of us who were trying to exercise free inquiry. We did that because we believed that sections of the Patriot Act would threaten a library's users' constitutional right and right to privacy because of what enhanced surveillance procedures might be capable of doing. Remember what I said about personally identifiable information. So back again, why are OSU libraries and press relevant to a campus conversation about free speech and freedom of expression? Our role as a research library, and especially one that has a university press attached to it, and our press publishes about 20 books a year, our role is to provide access to content, to read and to study and analyze. We enable the campus to access several $1 million worth of content, and this is not content that you're necessarily going to be able to find on the internet. And if you do, it's not necessarily going to be free. We do our utmost to provide that access to materials to support research and learning and teaching needs of OSU faculty and students. And with our collection building efforts, we endeavor to cover the signature areas of the university. And when we can't do it and there are information needs that are beyond what our collections have, we're going to borrow it for people and get access that way. And again, we do so to support inquiry and the creation of new knowledge, to promote and encourage thoughtful, informed engagement between individuals who may or may not have the same belief systems. And we assist students and faculty to find scholarship, news, history, and other content in order to learn those new ideas, discover diverse opinions and thoughts, and to be exposed to others exercising their freedom of expression. But I would say that our role as librarians, as a library, is not just to serve as a warehouse of books and journals and to be more than just a portal to a journal article. We take very seriously our role, as do faculty on this campus, to help students and enable their intellectual inquiry, promote their critical evaluation of information. So they're asking questions like, if you're reading this book, is it current? Is it timely? Is this book reliable? Does the author or authors have biases? Because that is really going to help us reach ultimately a goal of helping students be successful and be better at research and become better and well-informed citizens. And as my friend Susie Brubaker-Cole said, one of the university's highest missions is to educate people for democracy. And I did want to say one thing about the street preachers, because more recently we at OSU Libraries and Press have really been challenged when our strongly held beliefs about freedom of expression and free speech were juxtaposed against other values that we have, diversity and inclusion and civility. And there's that tension that Andrew mentioned. Those of you who've been on campus for some time know that the Valley Library is a hub of activity. We see easily the entire student body FTE come through our doors, 30,000 people a week. And as a result of that, we are an occasional location for that group that's colloquially known as the Angry Street Preachers. And as hateful and abhorrent as their speech is, and I do personally find it offensive, they are free to say what they say, no matter how offensive, because that's that expression that we believe in, freedom of expression. And as long as they are abiding by other university standards in terms of time, place, manner. But we are free to combat that speech and to exercise what Susie said, our counter speech. So one of the library's counter activities has been to launch a campaign that we call Speak Freely, Speak Kindly. And I think that aligns well with the university's newly minted freedom of expression statement, and it demonstrates our strong desire on this campus to create an inclusive environment where everyone's provided an equal opportunity to succeed, learn, explore, and engage in dialogue. Thanks.
All right. Speak freely, speak kindly. Last but not least, is my great colleague, Professor Joseph Orosco. He's Associate Professor in the Philosophy Faculty of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, as well as President of the OSU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. He directs the OSU Peace Studies program, and he co-directs the Anaris Project for Alternative Futures. Orosco is dedicated to engaged philosophy and has written on political theory of various figures, including Josiah Royce, Jane Addams, Martin Luther King, and Cesar Chavez, including a book on Chavez and the common sense of nonviolence. And it has an exciting new book just published in October entitled Toppling the Melting Pot, Immigration and Multiculturalism in American Philosophy. Get your copies now. And please help me in welcoming Professor Orosco.
All right, well, thank you all, especially those of you who are sticking around after listening to many of these important remarks. I want to thank the panel and thank you for the organizers of this event at Schipper, the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. My remarks today are the result of thinking about some of these issues for, I realize today, over 20 years that I've been teaching philosophy of law, constitutional issues, and also as someone who teaches and thinks about nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, and so forth, and also occasioned by my role as the president of the OSU chapter of the American Association of University Professors, a over 100-year organization that is dedicated to the preservation of academic freedom in U.S. universities. So I want to talk about thinking about how we might think about free speech, and the way in which I usually hear this talked about in my classes is in this way: a distinction between free speech as a legal right or a legal norm and free speech as a social norm or an expectation in society. As a legal right, freedom of speech refers to rules and regulations that prohibit state agencies from arbitrarily or unreasonably restricting the freedom of expression of citizens. This doesn't mean that there can be no restrictions on speech, as we've heard. The Supreme Court of the United States has allowed for state agencies to put into place, time, and manner restrictions on the freedom of expression, usually to protect public order. But it also prohibits the state from policing the content of what people can say, no matter how rude or offensive. So the only legal restrictions that the Supreme Court has recognized can be put on speech are those that may, according to the Brandenburg Rule from 1969, that may incite people to immediate unlawful action. So the Supreme Court has steadily come out and said that hate speech is allowable speech. The only time that the government can engage in policing people's speech is if someone says something that would incite people to engage in breaking the law in an immediate sort of way. So for instance, we talked about this last time in our Constitution event, that preceded this. Chalking on OSU sidewalks, hurt certain groups of people or kill certain groups of people. As a legal rule, these are allowable, right, under freedom of speech. They may violate our social norms and our institutional norms as OSU, but as a legal right to say something like kill this group of people, this is constitutionally protected speech. The only reason that you could prevent someone from engaging in any kind of speech is if they said, let's now, right now, go to some place and engage in immediate unlawful action. But it has to be immediate. You can't even say, for instance, let's go organize and get this group of people 2 weeks from now. The Supreme Court has recognized that that kind of speech is still protected because it's not immediate unlawful action. So the requirements, as Professor Valls has laid out, are in some sense very absolute. Rude and offensive remarks, unfortunately, are constitutionally protected according to our legal regime. But as a social norm, free speech is a little bit different. People usually take free speech to involve both a right and a duty. Individuals have a right to express their opinion, whatever it may be, and others have a duty to respect that opinion. This is usually how I hear students talk about this, that I have an opinion and you have a right to listen to me, and perhaps even not challenge me. I have had people say this in classes that, look, if I say something, if I have an opinion, you don't have a right to challenge me because I have a right to free speech. This is usually this way, which is interpreted as free speech as a social norm. And this usually means that you must let it stand or tolerate expression no matter what. So tied up here is the idea that the right to free speech creates a duty on others to tolerate, respect, and be civil. As an organization, the AAUP has expressed concern with the possibility of conflating these two meanings of free speech as a legal right and a social norm, especially in regard to a value that is enunciated in the Statement on Free Speech, which is that of civility. Over the past few years, the university has engaged in a campaign of trying to encourage civility on campus, and this is concerning to the AAUP. Not because we are against civility and civil discourse on campus. The worry is about making civility or collegiality, getting along, as a standard for performance evaluations of faculty and staff. The AAUP is worried because a value such as civility is very vague and undefined and is often very culturally conditioned about what it means to be civil. As such, this value of civility can be used as a disciplinary tool by supervisors and administrators to punish people, faculty and staff, and particularly women or people of color who may not fit a certain stereotypical role or who may not want to express themselves in, quote unquote, a civil way. So the stand of AAUP is that focusing on civility and respect puts focus on the manner in which things get said and expressed rather than on the content of what people are trying to say. This approach is one that AAU brings to a variety of issues about freedom of expression. We're concerned that we not create arbitrary or unfair rules that focus in ways to punish people for what they have to say. So in the past the past couple of years, universities across the nation, including OSU, have experienced a wave of student protests that have prodded faculty and administrators to think about how the university ought to balance freedom of expression with the demands of social justice, public order, and their own academic missions. This last summer was one that was filled with news about the University of Chicago Dean of Students, John Ellison, who wrote a response to student protests. And in a letter to incoming first-year students, he wrote that the University of Chicago does not support the use of trigger warnings, does not cancel controversial speakers who might say offensive things on campus, and that the University of Chicago would not support the idea of creating safe spaces on campus. Well, just 1 week later, about 200 faculty responded to Ellison in an open letter and saying that his letter foreclosed discussion on campus and was in direct violation not only of academic freedom but freedom of speech by foreclosing the possibility of considering trigger warnings and safe spaces, and that this was damaging to democracy to have an administrator lay out these kinds of conditions for what is an academic environment. The national AAUP position on these issues about trigger warnings and safe spaces follows the reasoning on the position of civility. That is, we're concerned that trigger warnings and the idea of safe spaces might be used as policies by supervisors to unfairly and arbitrarily diminish academic freedom. The concern is that the discussion of trigger warnings and safe spaces will become codified or become some kind of university rule that can be used by arbitrary administrators to discipline faculty members with rules containing vague or undefined terms, seeking to pursue social justice on the cheap. This is the real concern, is that the AAUP is sometimes worried that these kinds of ideas can be used and can be fronted forward by administrators instead of making really deep and substantial changes in the university to address questions of social justice and to address historic inequalities which might marginalize many kinds of groups of people. So the worry is that universities might use policies on trigger warnings or safe spaces and say, see, we're doing something, even though there's much larger sort of economic structural issues at play. So these are important debates to have about trigger warnings, safe spaces, and so forth, and universities should create the space to discuss them. OSU students should be encouraged, I believe, and the university in its new policy is doing this, to encourage protest and to encourage students to agitate in order to ensure that OSU lives up to its core mission of creating a diverse, inclusive, and equitable university that serves the state of Oregon by cultivating critical and creative citizens. But students, I think, also need to learn how to be creative about protests and move beyond the usual activist routine of march, petition, and sign waving. In the past 30 years, there have been amazingly powerful social movements around the world that have developed innovative ways to dissent. So I think back to the movement of the anti-Milosevic movement in Serbia in the late 1990s, early 2000s. One group decided to engage in a protest by putting a picture of the Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic on the side of a metal barrel. And then they asked people to come and beat it with a bat for a penny. And they put this out in a public square and let people take a swing at this much-hated politician. In the nation of Syria before the civil war, the anti-Assad movement decided to engage in a protest of golf balls. They would paint pictures of Assad or certain kinds of color-coded anti-Assad colors, and then they would take boxes of these golf balls and then just let them loose down stairwells, into public areas. And the rules, according to Assad, about this were that the police would have to pick up all the golf balls. So this created a kind of crazy cop situation in which you had activists dumping golf balls, creating these kinds of messes, and then they would have to watch the police pick up each individual golf ball. And this created an impression to the citizens around who are watching this take place that there was something silly and stupid about the dictatorial powers of the Assad government, that maybe they should think about how the Assad government was infringing their rights in very, very minuscule ways. Now, I gave these examples not necessarily to encourage you to go out and do this on campus, but to give you the idea that there are many, many different kind of creative ways than just having a march or a rally, and those are important methods as well. But over the past 40 years in various kinds of cultural revolutions around the country, there have been these innovative ways to express speech. And I want to encourage people to think about this. And if anyone is interested, you can go to the website of the Albert Einstein Institute, which is run by the nonviolent theorist Gene Sharp, who has codified over 200 different methods of nonviolent protest and ways to engage that move beyond petitions, rallies, and marches. And so while we're encouraging protest and we're encouraging creative new ways of counter-speech, we need to consider the ways in which we continue to make universities more inclusive. We need better ways of being aware of diverse experiences and the learning styles of our students and how we best can accommodate those diverse learning styles to see to the success of our students. We need to realize also that the university ought to allow many different kinds of conversations and spaces to take place. Not all conversations need to be intellectual dialogues and panel discussions dedicated to achieving rational consensus. Sometimes we should create spaces that are emotional, spaces that are angry, and some spaces that are joyful affirmations of how groups of students see solidarity with one another and not with others. We need diverse kinds of communication, diverse kinds of spaces. And sometimes our classrooms are not necessarily the best place for these kinds of expressions. But we should seek to try to find ways in which we can have many different kinds of speech, many different kinds of expressions as possible. Let many flowers bloom in terms of free speech. But likewise, I think we ought to realize, too, that some speech can have the effect of undermining the ability of some individuals to participate in rational dialogue, because this kind of speech questions the right or the capacity of some people to be human or even to engage in dialogue. So since the election 2 weeks ago here at OSU faculty have reported to AAUP representatives a number of shocking incidents that have occurred here on campus involving intimidation, harassment, and displays of white supremacy. So I want to articulate just a couple of these because I think it's important that we know that these things are going on. It's been reported to us at the AAUP that a student told a faculty member that there was a young white male student sitting with a group of Latinx students here on campus in one of the cafeterias. A group of young white males walked up to them and addressed the white male who was sitting with the Latinx group and said, "You know, you don't have to sit with them anymore, right?" Very recently, in the past week, a Latina black student was walking through the quad when a group of white students holding Confederate flags surrounded her. They yelled horrible things at her, and many of these things we would consider hate speech, intimidation, or harassment. Many faculty have expressed to us in the AAUP that they feel intimidated or harassed because of what they're teaching in classes, particularly if they are in ethnic studies or gender studies or women's studies. And the administration has responded to these faculty by saying, why don't you have a one-on-one meeting with that student, ignoring the fact that the faculty members are feeling intimidated by some of these students. So we need to think about how to accommodate and make people feel safe on campus. The question is, how do we do that? Safe spaces are a very sort of difficult kind of proposal to sort of think about, and the AAUP is not sure that this is an appropriate way to go. Personally, I would say, too, also that I think that the idea of safe space is dangerous in some ways to think about, and for this reason. I think of safe space in the same way I think about safe sex. There's no such thing. Right. There can be safer sex, and this was a movement of sex education many, many years ago, to stop talking about safe sex and to talk about safer sex. That is, we can never, ever totally be safe. White supremacy, homophobia, all sorts of the isms infiltrate our lives in many, many different ways, sometimes unknown to us in very minute detail. And so even in our safe spaces, activists have often talked about the ways in which patriarchal violence, homophobia, and so forth seep in and can infiltrate activist spaces. So spaces that seem safe before can suddenly seem very unsafe. We ought to be careful about thinking about creating safe spaces, because it might not be possible to create such spaces. However, I think we can speak about safer spaces, or accountable spaces, or even just spaces. This means having rules and practices in place that protect academic freedom as well as freedom of expression, but toward the service of the core mission of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which are the core values of OSU as an institution. So when we talk about the balancing of our values in various ways, freedom of speech has to be balanced against the values of why we are here today in this room at this university, which is to create a kind of a democratic political space, a democratic space in which we value one another creatively and critically. And in order to do that, we need to protect diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so the question is, how do we create spaces in which we constantly reiterate that we're here to protect diversity, we're here to protect inclusion of populations that have been historically marginalized, and we're here to treat everybody equitably. And in that case, certain kinds of speech must be met with the fiercest kind of counterspeech, the most kind of creative counterspeech, both by the university and by our students, faculty, and staff. So I would like to end by just saying, how can we work not only to create safe spaces, I would actually change that to be just spaces, but ones in which we preserve the mission of OSU and try to work toward an Oregon that is, in fact, democratic, inclusive, and in the best traditions of our state, progressive. Thank you.